The house on Hollowfield Lane didn't look like the kind of place that could keep a secret, yet it had been holding one for years. Set back from the narrow road and surrounded by tall, skeletal trees, it stood with its paint peeling in long curls and its windows dark even during the day. The boards nailed across the front door and first-floor windows weren't new. They had been there so long that the wood had turned gray and splintered. People passing by could hear the wind whistle through the cracks, but some swore it wasn't just wind. They said if you stood there long enough, you could hear faint noises inside, like someone trying to speak through a mouth full of water, or a laugh caught in a throat that didn't want to laugh. That it was late autumn, the kind of season where the air felt heavy with dampness and the ground stayed soft no matter how many dry days came in a row. The neighborhood was quiet, but not empty. Families still lived in the surrounding houses, though most avoided walking past the Hollowfield property unless they had to. They didn't make eye contact with it. Even the mailman crossed the street before he reached its front gate, as though proximity alone could stir something awake. But years earlier, this was just another family home. Back then, the lawn was trimmed, the shutters were painted deep green, and the front porch smelled faintly of coffee in the mornings. The Hollowfields had lived there for almost 2 decades. Neighbors remembered the parents, quiet, polite, and never too friendly. They had 2 children, both well-behaved, though not the sort to join games or talk to other kids after school. They walked together everywhere, keeping a small but unshakable distance from the rest of the world. Outsiders. The Hollowfields' life seemed steady. They were not rich, but they were not struggling either. The father worked long hours in a job he never discussed, and the mother kept the house in perfect order, rarely stepping beyond its walls except for groceries or the occasional church service. On Sundays, the family sat together in the same pew, speaking to no one. People assumed they were just private. Inside, however, the air was different. There was an order to the home that went beyond tidiness. It was controlled. Voices stayed low. Doors closed without sound. Every movement seemed measured. Friends of the children, few as they were, noticed how the parents' presence seemed to change the temperature in a room. A joke would die in midair, laughter drying up as if it had never happened. Still, nothing about them screamed danger. The Hollowfields were simply distant, and maybe that's why no one noticed the slow tightening of something inside those walls. The children grew quieter with each passing year. The father's absences grew longer. The mother began keeping the curtains drawn even during the brightest days, claiming it was to keep the furniture from fading. Sometimes at night, neighbors heard what they thought was an argument. Sharp, muffled voices rising and falling. But the next morning, the family would appear as composed as ever. Other times, there were smaller sounds, the faint thud of footsteps at odd hours, a scrape against wood, a sound like furniture being dragged. These were brushed off as normal household noises. There were power dynamics at play, though no one outside the house could see them. The father had a way of speaking that left no room for questions. The mother's silence was not just politeness, it was survival. And the children seemed to understand something about their home that they never dared put into words. If you looked closely, you could see cracks in the picture. The boy's shirt sleeves were always pulled down over his wrists, even in summer. The girl carried her school books pressed tightly to her chest, as though protecting them, or herself, from something unseen. They smiled when spoken to, but the smiles never reached their eyes. The last autumn before the house was sealed, something began to shift. The children stopped walking to school together. The boy began missing days entirely. The mother was seen in town more often, moving quickly, glancing over her shoulder as though checking for someone. The father's car sat in the driveway less and less, but when it was there, the whole house seemed to go still, and one yet knew that behind those nailed windows, the Hollowfield home was changing. The walls that once held silences were now holding something heavier, something that breathed in the dark and pressed against the people who lived there. It was still a family home, technically, but the word home was beginning to mean something else entirely. The night the nails went in, no one saw it happen. But the next morning, every door and window on the first floor was boarded up tight. The family was nowhere to be seen. And for those who stood in front of it long enough, The Hollowfield house no longer looked like a place where people had lived. It looked like something trying very hard to keep something inside. IT started with the small changes no one could name at first. A week after the Hollowfield house was sealed from the inside, people would try to remember the little shifts that had been happening for months before that night. The father, always a man who kept his voice even, had started raising it. Not in the way that came with sudden bursts of anger, but in the slow, deliberate kind of way where each word carried weight. The kind of tone meant to leave a mark long after it was spoken. One evening, the boy came home later than usual. He had no explanation for where he had been. Dinner was waiting, steam still curling from the plates, but the father didn't tell him to sit. He told him to stand in the kitchen, silent, while the rest of the family ate. The girl didn't look at her brother once, her eyes fixed on her plate, as if staring at the food could make the moment pass faster. The mother's hands shook when she reached for the salt, and she set it down too hard, making the cutlery rattle. No one said a word after that, but the air in the house felt heavier for days. These moments became more frequent. The father's absences, when they came, were still long, but now they carried a sharper return. The house seemed to snap to attention when his car pulled into the driveway. The mother would gather the children into their rooms before he stepped through the door, as though preparing them. When he was home, conversations became shorter. The children learned to speak only when necessary, and the mother seemed to have perfected the art of answering without actually answering. Outside pressures were building, though the Hollowfields never spoke openly about them. The father's work, whatever it was, had taken a turn. He'd started coming home with his jaw tight, his clothes smelling faintly of oil and something metallic. Bills began piling on the hallway table, tucked under unopened letters. The mother had been overheard in the market asking if she could pay later for groceries. The family still looked composed from a distance, but cracks were showing that IT wasn't just money. There was a shadow from the father's past that he carried into every room. A story half-whispered by someone who had grown up with him. Something about an old fight, a debt that had never been paid, a person who had vanished without answers. No one could confirm if it was true, but the way he carried himself suggested he was a man who could outweigh the truth until people stopped asking. The mother's past wasn't clean either. A neighbor recalled once seeing her standing in the backyard at night, barefoot in the frost, staring up at the dark windows of the children's rooms. She hadn't moved until the neighbor coughed loudly to announce their presence. After that, she vanished inside without a word. There were rumors she had once tried to leave the Hollowfield house years ago, disappearing for almost a week before returning. But when she came back, she was quieter, her posture straighter, as if something had been put back in place. The children were caught in between, but they weren't just silent victims. The boy had started testing boundaries, staying out later, slipping things into his school bag that didn't belong to him. The girl, on the other hand, withdrew further. Teachers said she had begun spending recess alone, writing in a notebook she wouldn't let anyone touch. She watched her brother like she was waiting for him to break a rule so big he couldn't walk back from it. There were moments when the siblings whispered together in the corner of the yard, their voices low but their expressions tense. They weren't planning games anymore. They were planning something else. One afternoon, the girl came inside from school with a scrape on her cheek. She said it happened in the hallway, but the way she flinched when her father brushed past her made the mother freeze mid-stepped up EY late summer. The air inside the Hollowfield home felt different. Doors were closing harder. Meals were eaten faster. The father began locking the basement door, keeping the key on a chain around his neck. The boy tried it once when his father was gone, pressing his ear to the door. He swore he heard a faint humming sound, mechanical but not quite steady. When the key turned in the front door minutes later, he was already in his room pretending to sleep. Hidden grievances were stacking up quietly. The mother resented the father's control, but she had long ago learned that pushing back came with a price. The boy resented both parents, though for different reasons. The girl, no one could tell if she resented anyone, but her silence had taken on a new edge. The father seemed to sense the shifts. He began testing his kind of control, locking the children in their rooms at night, checking their schoolwork for mistakes with a cold precision. Once, when the boy mouthed off at him, The father simply stared until the boy stopped speaking. Ing. Then he walked away. The silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been. By the time the first frost came, no one in that house trusted anyone else. The mother had taken to sleeping with a small metal object under her pillow. The boy started keeping a knife he'd found in the garage hidden under his mattress. The girl was never without her notebook, which she now kept tucked into the waistband of her skirt. The Hollowfield home was no longer just tense. It was a trap, and everyone inside knew it. They were circling each other, waiting for someone to make the move that would set the rest of them off. And when it happened, it wouldn't be loud at first. It would be quiet, too quiet, before the screams came. It happened on a night when the air outside felt like it was holding its breath. The wind had stilled, the moon hung pale and thin, and every sound in the Hollowfield house seemed louder than it should have been. Somewhere deep inside, the low mechanical hum from the locked basement door had stopped. The absence of it made the silence feel unnatural. The father had come home late, his boots leaving wet prints across the kitchen floor. The mother was at the table, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles were white. She had not made dinner. The children were upstairs, awake but silent, listening to the sound of his steps moving from room to room. He wasn't speaking. Not to them. Not to anyone. It began with a single door opening. Too quickly, too forcefully. The boy's door. Heavy footsteps. The creak of floorboards. A voice low but sharp. Words neither child would repeat later. Not even to each other. Then came the sound of the boy's voice, raised in a way it had never been before. The girl's breathing quickened in the dark. When the father's voice rose, it wasn't in anger. It was colder than that. It was the sound of someone making a decision. The boy shouted something, a refusal, followed by the crash of something small and wooden hitting the wall. The girl heard her brother's feet hitting the floor as he moved. Then there was a thud, flesh on wood, followed by silence. The mother was moving now, her chair scraping hard against the kitchen tiles. She was up the stairs in seconds, her footsteps frantic, her voice breaking as she called the boy's name. But the father's shadow filled the doorway before she reached it. His face was pale but steady. The mother tried to push past him. His arms stopped her like a wall. The girl had opened her own door now, standing in the hallway, watching everything through the half-light. The boy was on the floor, his lips split, blood running. Down his chin, his eyes were wide, not just in pain but in defiance. The father told him to get up. The boy refused. The father's jaw tightened. What happened next came in a blur. The mother reached into her pocket and pulled out the small metal object she'd been sleeping with for weeks. A screwdriver, its handle worn smooth. She didn't raise it high, didn't shout. She simply stepped forward, quick and sure, and drove it into the side of the father's neck. There was a sound, half gasp, half growl. His hands went to his throat, his knees buckled, and his eyes locked on hers in disbelief. Blood came fast, spilling across his shirt and onto the floor. The girl's breath caught. The boy froze, his hands halfway to pushing himself up. The mother didn't speak. She just stood there, breathing hard, her grip still tight on the screwdriver. The father stumbled forward, catching the edge of the wall before crumpling. The thud of his body against the floor shook the pictures hanging on the hallway walls. The smell of blood filled the air quickly, metallic and thick. The girl could taste it in the back of her throat. The boy scrambled to his feet, staring at his mother as though seeing her for the first time. She told him to lock the front door. Her voice was steady, almost too steady. The next few minutes moved strangely. The boy slid the deadbolt into place. The girl closed her door, but didn't go inside. The mother knelt by the father's body, pressing her hand against the wound, but not in a way that would stop the bleeding. It was more like she was making sure he stayed down. When the breathing stopped, the silence was worse than before. The mother stood and told the children to go to their rooms. Neither moved. She repeated herself. This time they obeyed. In the hours that followed, there was no crying, no wailing. The mother moved through the house with quiet purpose. She dragged the body toward the basement door, leaving a dark, uneven trail on the wooden floorboards. The key clinked against her wrist as she unlocked it. The basement swallowed them both, the mother and the body, into the dark. When she came back up, Her hands were clean. She locked the door again, put the key back around her neck, and sat at the kitchen table. The boy came down first. Hours later, his face pale. He asked her what would happen now. She didn't answer. The girl followed, her notebook clutched against her chest. She didn't ask anything at all. By morning, the nails were in. The mother worked fast, hammering each board into place across the front door, the windows. The sound of each strike echoed through the empty rooms. He children helped without being told. No one spoke. When the last nail went in, the house was sealed. Outside, the sun was rising. Inside, the Hollowfield family sat at the table, 3 chairs instead of 4. The air was still, the smell of iron lingering faintly in the walls. They didn't know it yet, but the moment the nails went in, the Hollowfield home stopped being a house and became something else. A locked box with a secret inside, waiting for someone to open it. By the morning after the nails were in, the Hollowfield house was no longer a home anyone approached. From the street, it looked like a place that had been abandoned for years. Inside, the air felt stale, heavy with the smell of wood and the faint, almost hidden trace of blood. The mother moved through the rooms in silence, pausing now and then as if listening for a sound only she could hear. The children stayed close to each other, but they didn't speak about what had happened. It was as though naming it out loud would make it real in a way they couldn't undo. In the first days, the mother tried to carry on with small routines. She swept the kitchen, washed the dishes, and boiled water for tea that no one drank. She didn't speak about the father. She didn't speak about the basement. When the boy finally asked if they would tell someone, she told him no, firmly, like it wasn't open for discussion. "It's done," she said, her voice flat. "We keep going." The boy obeyed, but his eyes changed. There was something restless in him now, a tightness in the way he moved. He started pacing at night, his steps soft but constant, like he was trying to wear a path into the floor. The girl became even quieter, scribbling in her notebook for hours at a time, her handwriting smaller and smaller until the lines blurred together. The guilt, when it came, didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, in the spaces between silence. The mother told herself it had been necessary, that she had done what she did to protect the children. She repeated it in her head like a prayer, but the image of the father's eyes, wide, startled, almost questioning, would come back to her when she closed her own. Outside the house, the Hollowfields' absence was noticed quickly. The neighbors, who had always kept a cautious distance, began talking. Some said the family had left in the night. Others said EY had been forced out. A few whispered darker theories, that something terrible had happened inside. No one had proof, but the boarded windows became proof enough for most. The community's unease grew. The mail piled up at the end of the driveway. The grass went uncut. People crossing the street to avoid the house would glance up at the upper windows, swearing they saw movement, a shadow shifting just out of sight. Kids dared each other to run up and touch the front porch, but none of them ever lingered long enough to hear if there were voices inside. Weeks passed, but the mother didn't leave. She rationed the food they had, sending the boy out only after dark to retrieve whatever he could from the garden shed or the edge of a neighbor's compost heap. He moved like a shadow, returning quickly, his hands always cold. The girl rarely left her room, but when she did, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall where the blood had once been before her mother scrubbed it clean. Rumors reached beyond the neighborhood. A missing persons notice for the father appeared in the local paper, alongside a small photograph taken years earlier. The article was short, just enough to note his absence, his place of work, and the fact that his family was unreachable. No one mentioned that the family was still inside the very same house. The pressure mounted slowly, almost imperceptibly. A police car drove past more often. Once, 2 officers got out and walked the perimeter, knocking on the boards. The mother stood silently inside, the children frozen in place. The officers left, shaking their heads. Inside, the strain was taking its toll. The boy began snapping at the girl over small things. How she left the cup on the counter. How she wouldn't answer when he spoke. The mother intervened less and less, her voice growing thinner with each passing day. She was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't touch. The crime had changed their shapes, not just how they moved, but how they thought of themselves. The boy, once defiant, now carried a sharp edge of bitterness. The girl's silence had deepened into something unreadable, a look that made it impossible to tell if she was afraid or simply watching. The mother drifted between moments of steel-hard resolve and waves of quiet, crushing doubt. When the first snow came, the house seemed to sink deeper into itself. No one had come to arrest them. No one had even knocked on the door again. The world outside was moving on, but inside Hollowfield Lane, time had slowed to a crawl. The board stayed in place. The basement stayed locked. The family's world had shrunk to four walls and the weight of what they'd done. The community's whispers softened as winter wore on, but the unease never left. People avoided talking about the Hollowfields directly, as if speaking their name could summon something. The children at the school, the ones who remembered the siblings, would occasionally ask each other what they thought had happened. But over time, even those questions faded, leaving only the story of a house sealed with nails and a family no one saw again. Inside, the mother sat at the kitchen table one night, staring at the grain in the wood. Her hands rested flat against it. The boy stood in the doorway, watching her. The girl, in the corner, was writing something down, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the room. None of them spoke, but the air between them was thick with the knowledge that the crime had not ended the night it happened. It had only begun. Years passed before the Hollowfield house was opened again. By the time the boards came down, the world outside had changed. Neighbors had moved away, the trees had grown taller, and the street no longer carried the same curious glances toward the property. When the authorities finally entered, they found what they expected in some ways, and what they could never have prepared for in others. The basement told the truth the mother had hidden, and the silence of the room spoke for the years no one had lived a real life inside. The legal consequences came slowly, not because there was doubt about what had happened, but because no one had been watching closely when it mattered. The mother was arrested, the image of her being led out in a faded sweater and untied shoes landing on the front page of the local paper. She didn't struggle, didn't protest. In court, she didn't deny what she had done. She only said that it had been necessary. Her lawyer called it self-defense, a desperate act to protect her children from a man whose control had turned dangerous. The prosecution called it premeditated murder. The children, now older, told conflicting stories. The boy said his mother had saved him. The girl said nothing at all. They were placed in the care of relatives they barely knew, moving through foster homes when those arrangements failed. The boy carried his mother's version of events with him, repeating it like a shield. The girl carried her notebook, the one sheet F, filed in the months before the crime, refusing to let anyone read it. Justice, if you could call it that, came in the form of a sentence. The mother would spend decades in prison. Some called it too long, others not long enough. But the damage had already been done. The family had been destroyed the moment the screwdriver struck. The law could not undo that. It could only record it. The community reacted in predictable ways at first: shock, outrage, fascination. People who had once avoided speaking to the Hollowfields now spoke as though they had known them well. Stories changed in the telling. Some remembered signs of trouble no one had mentioned before. Others claimed the mother had always looked off, that her eyes had held something cold. In time, the outrage faded, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance. The house was eventually sold, repainted, and rented to a young couple who didn't know the full story. But for those who had lived on Hollowfield Lane during those years, the memory never left. It became a cautionary tale told in lowered voices about the things that happen behind closed doors, the way a family can look whole while splintering from the inside, and how the truth can stay buried until it's too late, but on a broader scale. The case sparked quiet conversations about the limits of intervention. Neighbors wondered if they should have stepped in earlier, if there had been a moment when asking the right question might have changed the ending. But those thoughts were fleeting. People are quick to move on when the tragedy isn't theirs to carry. The Hollowfield case also drew attention to how power works inside families, how control can be maintained without leaving bruises that strangers can see. It wasn't just about violence. It was about silence, about how fear can be enforced with a glance, a tone, a rule that no one dares break. And when that control is challenged, it can end in ways that leave no winners. Morality became a point of quiet debate. Was the mother's act murder, or was it the final desperate move of someone cornered for too long? Did the years of control and quiet harm justify what she did? The law had its answer, but people had their own, and those answers didn't always match. In the end, the case wasn't just about the hoe. Lowfields, it was about the uncomfortable truth that most families have lines no one else can see, and crossing them can set off something irreversible. The boy grew into a man who still moved like someone expecting a blow. He avoided the subject of his father, but he avoided his mother's name too. The girl, quieter still, disappeared from public view entirely. Her notebook, never opened by anyone, was found years later in a second-hand shop in another city, its pages still closed tight by a worn elastic band. Whoever bought it didn't know what they were holding. The mother, in prison, kept mostly to herself. She worked in the kitchen, read when she could, and rarely spoke of her past. Once, when a reporter asked if she regretted it, she paused for a long time before answering. "Regret doesn't matter," she said. "It's done." And maybe that was the truest thing about the Hollowfield story. There was no undoing it. The crime was not just the night in the hallway. It was every quiet year that had led to it. It was the silence, the control, the unspoken rules that had held the family together until they didn't. The house still stands on Hollowfield Lane. The paint is fresh, the windows unboarded, the garden overgrown but alive. Most who pass by now don't know its history. But sometimes when the wind is just right, those who remember swear they can hear a faint sound from inside. Not screams, not voices, but the echo of nails being driven into wood, one after another, sealing the past in place.